Imposter Syndrome. What is it? According to Wikipedia, despite external evidence of their competence, those experiencing this remain convinced that they are frauds and do not deserve all they have achieved, and someone will come and pull off the mask. I don't mean to make this feel like a depressing episode of the New Normal podcast, but I need to get this out there. I interviewed Amber in July of 2020. Today, it's the end of January 2022. If you listen to the episode, you will hear me at the end say how I want to get this show out really quickly, faster than normal. So what happened? 2 weeks before the interview, I was informed that after 25 years, I was being terminated. Game over. I went from gung-ho, let's go, and get stuff done, to confused and without goals. And the pandemic just turned up the volume. I've been carrying this over me for 18 months, but as I said in a previous episode, I was going to correct it. So Amber, here is your interview. Many things have changed since this was recorded. Amber has moved on. Oh, she's still at LinkedIn, but no longer in marketing. She's moved to the dark side. Just kidding. She made the pivot and is now enterprise sales leader. My name is Andrew Mayer, and welcome to the New Normal Podcast. This podcast is about innovation and innovating in these ever-changing times. In this interview, we talk about an 11-year-old book that she wrote together with Jay Baer. We talk about the social telephone and how customer experience on social media is doing. Then I have Amber talk to me about imposter syndrome. At that point, we pivot back to LinkedIn and talk about what people usually get wrong on LinkedIn and what lesson they should take away from this podcast. Hope you enjoy it. Amber Naslund, Enterprise Sales Leader at LinkedIn. In preparation for the interview today, I went to my bookshelf and I found a book called The Now Revolution, written by Amber Naslund and Jay Baer. What I wanted to ask you here today, actually, I wanted to read something quickly out of the book here. So just to jog your memory.
Fun. Feel like live reading. You're going to have to remind me what I wrote. All those.
That's right. And maybe this was a chapter Jay wrote. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Who knows?
Once upon a time, customer contact was centralized around the switchboard, and the phone was the preferred method of communication between companies and customers. When it rang, you answered. Now the calls are coming in through the social phone. So there were 7 tips or 7 chapters into the book there that talk about things. For those who don't know the book, this was written almost 10 years ago.
It's crazy. I feel like a lifetime ago. It's crazy.
Isn't it? And I wanted to know, how much progress have we made in those almost 10 years since you published this book?
Wow, that's so hard to quantify. In some ways, I do feel like there's some of this stuff that's normalized to some degree. If you watch how people interact online, how many times have you had an experience with a company where you've had a frustrating customer service experience and the first place you go is Twitter versus
That's right.
Right. Like you go to Twitter to rant about it.
Yep.
And I think that the challenging thing is I still don't think we're at the point where we expect a quality response from that channel. I still think that we're a little bit pleasantly surprised if the company reaches out and is like, hey, we're paying attention and we'd like to help you. I still don't think that having social integrated into the customer service experience from an operational perspective is as mature as it should be. I think when I watch how companies continue to struggle with siloed ways of communicating with their customers, social is still one of those boxes that they kind of try to check.
But that team,
yeah, that team is often really separate, right? So like the social media team is often a frontline marketing organization, and yet the customer service teams are separate and never the twain shall meet sometimes. Unfortunately, I would like to say that all of the things that we hoped for 10 years ago have come to pass, but I think digital transformation in its umbrella sense is a long, slow burn that's going to take probably a generation, I think, before my kid's generation, she's 13. And I think by the time she is an adult, that's table stakes. Like they expect to communicate this way. And so I think a lot of organizations are going to have their hand forced. But it's so hard. It's like, it's operationally tricky. It's culturally really tricky for
Mhm.
companies. So we're getting there in little tiny pieces, but it's certainly not mainstream yet in the way that I think we all thought it might be 10 years
So
ago.
I started my Service Please sideshow in 2010, and I did a 10-year review at the end of last year.
Mhm.
But the idea was I had set myself a 10-year plan. By the year 2020, presto, I was going to change. I was going to fix the way corporations interacted with customers in the digital space. And I took review at the end of the year before Christmas. And I was pretty sober about it. It's like, we didn't make a lot of progress. There's a lot more
Right.
knowledge, and things that are in this book that you wrote with Jay almost 10 years ago are still absolutely as relevant for companies to read and understand as they were 10 years ago, which is shocking.
It is shocking.
We all have these devices now. I mean, 10 years ago, this wasn't normal. IT managers, CIOs didn't have smartphones in their pockets in 2010. Now
Yep.
they do. They
Yeah.
understand it. They chat with their children or grandchildren using WhatsApp and messengers or whatever it might
Mhm.
be. They also appreciate the smart notification from a company and all. But in their own company, as you rightly said, it's still a silo. I
Very
don't know
much so.
what it's going to take, although I'm watching the other side right now of the work at home movement, which we've all around the world have been affected by. And I just saw an article, actually, somebody posted on LinkedIn about the Swiss pharmaceutical company Novartis
Yep.
is going to allow, what was it, 110,000 employees, whatever number, to work
Some
from
crazy amount.
home,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I saw 2 weeks ago or a week, 10 days ago with Siemens, and I posted thinking, these are just really traditional. I'm based in Germany and Europe here. I've lived here for a long time. These are
Right.
stoic Germanic companies that resisted that kind of digital transformation. And now they're saying, Bob's your uncle. Let's go. We're going to move and do this. So
Yeah, it's
maybe,
crazy to
maybe
watch.
the next 10 years, the second part of this generation that you described, we get this change here. Maybe they'll understand the effect of this and how positive it can be for businesses. But it is hard to do. It's hard.
I feel like some of it is that they haven't yet. I mean, what makes companies pay attention? Economic impact. So
Mhm.
when the bottom line starts to hurt is when they start to make material changes and when they can effectively diagnose
That's right.
that the thing that is hurting them financially are these mechanical things. So until they can draw a clear line between the things they're not doing digitally and the revenue that it's impacting, I think ultimately that will be the wake up call. I mean, right now, the work from home thing is happening because a bunch of people, the hand was forced and a bunch of people had to go work remotely. And now these companies, including mine, are looking around going, do we need all these buildings? Do we
Right.
need all this office space? Do we need to have, I mean, our company is not failing with all of the people working from their home offices. So the overhead that we're carrying
Mhm.
to keep all these people in our buildings, like, is that necessary? Do we
That's
need to
right.
keep doing that? So I think that forcing functions are necessary for broad sweeping change. And I do think that we've seen some smaller incremental change from organizations, but a big digital sea change isn't going to happen until they feel the pinch financially. And I don't know if that'll happen in our lifetimes.
It's always when the pain happens, right? It's when the
Right.
taxi company becomes an Uber. It's when the hotel is the Airbnbs, and then
Yep.
they suddenly realize, oh, we need to play in this game as well.
Exactly.
It's gonna be piecemeal. I have a feeling that you're right for a while. I've often felt in the last few years that when that CIO of companies, the one who makes decisions of what technologies we're going to put in place, how are we going
Mhm.
to run our business here, when that person who is today 57, 59, 63 years old, when they
Yep.
retire and the 41-year-old takes over, there might be a bit more of a fresh wind coming in. And I mean, I'm part of that older generation. You don't have to be young or old to think modern or not, whatever, but
With
they're under a lot of pressures, right? If you're 61 years old, you're looking at your retirement package, you're looking at the success package. And if you go off on a big failure, you might lose whatever percentage of your takeaway bonus.
Yeah, I mean, rocking the boat becomes painful at that
Yeah.
point, right? And the change management that is required around this. Jay and I talked in the book too, all those years ago, and it's still very true today. That most of digital transformation work is cultural,
Yeah.
not operational. It has nothing to do with the tools or the whiz bangs or the technology or the tech stack. Like, all of that stuff is the result. The cultural change that's required to have that kind of
Mm.
mindset and to want to operate in a digital first way of working is cultural. And we still have like kind of a foot in both camps now, because to your point, we have one generation who did not grow up as digital natives. And then we have an entire influx of the last, like the incoming couple of generations of the workforce live and breathe this stuff and they can't imagine working any other way. So that dichotomy is real and is eventually going to be the thing that I think drags, companies kicking and screaming into the 21st century. One hopes maybe when by the time my kid enters the workforce, she'll be like, what do you mean we don't do it this way? Like that will feel weird to her if we don't.
Yeah, I have had a son who just went through a bunch of interviews for jobs and was so surprised he had to go somewhere dressed up and talk to
Right.
somebody face to face. I was like,
Show up in person, put on real clothing.
that's still kind of a thing. We are still humans, and I'm kind of happy for that. I wanted to shift to something because this is what this section of the podcast, I'm going to give a new name. I'm going to call it Amber's therapy moment here. I reached out to you in the fall last year when you posted at least one article you had written, and I'll link it in the show notes here, about imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
And I had never heard the phrase before. And I've Googled it a bit since then, and there's a lot written about it. So I was like, okay, I missed this whole thing. But then I read into it a little bit more, and I reached out to you, and I thought we might do a podcast months ago, and things just didn't work for different reasons here, and that's why we're here today. Schedules and life came into it, and now that everybody's at home through a virus, we have lots of time for these calls.
Lots of time to do that. Yeah.
So I want to tell you my situation. So I find it really easy for me to approach people, to ask them to come onto a podcast interview. Some accept, actually most accept, some don't because of whatever reasons we might have. I find it really easy to set them up, to do the research, to understand enough about the person so I feel confident, even if it's a CEO of a company. That's way beyond my league here. I can talk to them. But I'm always unsure when I finish the interview that the product that I'm going to put out there is of value. Was it really good? I know that all the steps up into it felt good. I understand how podcasting works. I don't have the greatest production value, but I don't promise or overpromise that either. But I'm kind of worried about what's going to go out. And I think this is basically what you're talking about, is that if we don't respect the effort that's put into creating or building, doing something there, because it comes easy to us, maybe, that we feel that we're not ready, we're not the right person, we're not valued, we shouldn't be doing this. Is that?
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. I mean, imposter syndrome is effectively the pervasive feeling that at any moment somebody's going to call you out and be like, "Wow, man, you've been pulling the wool over everybody's eyes."
You're talking my nightmares now.
Right, like that somebody's going to call you out as being a fraud or a fake or not really having the chops that you think that you do. And the key here is actually, despite the fact that you have evidence to the contrary. So like lots of people have confidence shortcomings. We all have our insecurities or our moments of self-doubt. But imposter syndrome in particular is like, no matter how many successful things that we have in our arsenal, we still feel as though that we can never quite measure up. And it was originally something that was studied in the 70s by a couple of female doctorate professors who were working with a field of students who were predominantly female. And they realized these are all very high achieving, accomplished women in this particular case. And they did not understand why these women were, going to defend their thesis and being like, I can't do this. Somebody's going to find out that I have no idea what I'm really doing here. And that I've just been, faking it the whole way through. So they started studying it. And of course, you hear it now a lot in professional circles, because especially I think what got me interested in looking at it is, of course, my own crises of confidence that came with some really rough professional, like I had a business that I started that failed pretty badly. And then I went through a couple of layoffs that were, again, not because of my performance, but ended up being, difficult for my confidence. And so I started really looking at this phenomenon and noticing that the collision with my work in social media was really apparent, because the world of social media exacerbates this so badly, because we're so hyper connected and it's easy to look left and right on Instagram and see somebody's very carefully curated, very highly filtered world and think to yourself, wow, like my messy, gnarly, crunchy life over here feels really inadequate by comparison. And that sort of trap of constantly comparing yourself is hard. And again, I'm raising a teenager and watching her sort of navigate the world of how her life and self feel as they develop, and looking at and comparing herself to other kids her age or kids who are older. Like, it's hard as a parent to navigate that too. So I've spent a lot of time reading and studying and thinking about it. And like, one of these days, I think there's a book in me on it. I keep trying and then like failing to actually write the book. But I've been doing a lot of writing about it because it's something that I think is a very universal feeling. And just like you, a lot of people don't have words for it. They're like, I know
Right.
the minute I start talking about it, they recognize it instantly. But they're like, I didn't know it had a name, but it
Right.
absolutely has a name, and it's a legitimate psychological kind of phenomenon that's been studied. And
Okay.
um, it's hard, and it's especially pervasive in people who are overall kind of high achievers, because our bar is just so high for what we believe is good enough that it's the opposite of the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is thinking that you are super competent when you're not, and just
Right.
it's like the polar opposite of imposter syndrome, which is constantly fighting that feeling like you're just pulling the wool over everybody's eyes.
If you
So
think
it's a tough one.
if you think of all the knobs and all the things I have to do before I even turn on Zoom here to record this interview here, I'm so worried that I test it 4 times and I make sure everything's gonna be perfect, because I can't afford any kind of flip up, because then Amber's gonna say, yeah, well, he was just I knew he was a beginner and he didn't have it in him. That's
Well,
that's what
first of all,
right.
what's so funny is I came on here and I've been so impressed with your production value. Like, you were so nice, and you've got the mic and the sound. You're fine. But I experience this at work all the time too, because I've been doing marketing type stuff for 20 some odd years, and I still walk into a room with a client, and there's always in the back of my mind some little thought of, why on earth does my opinion like
Mm,
matter to these
mm.
people? And aren't they going to start hearing me talk and think like, this broad has no idea what she's talking about? I still go through that 20 some odd years into my career, and having a body of evidence to show that I do know what I'm talking about. But that stuff still comes up every once in a while. And even like it's funny you mentioned the book thing. Writing the book about imposter syndrome, I have had so many bouts of imposter syndrome about writing about imposter syndrome, because it's like, well, who am I? I'm not Brittany Brown. I'm not, any of these like big, powerful, fancy New York Times bestselling authors. I'm not a psychiatrist. Like, who wants to hear from me on this? So the number of times I've put down the manuscript because I didn't feel adequate, or
Right.
I didn't feel like I had it was my place to talk about this.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this free session there, Amber. We'll close the analysis at this point, but thank you for giving me a word or term for it there. And
Now you know. Now when you feel it, you'll be like, oh, that's that thing again.
I feel it every time. It's 2 minutes before podcast recording time, and I'm checking my messages. They're not going to come. They're not going to come. They're going to cancel on me.
Yeah, I hear
Yeah.
you.
So let me shift something. Obviously, you work at LinkedIn now. You've been there
I
for
do.
a couple of years. You are a senior content consultant.
Mhm.
Okay. What does a senior content consultant do at LinkedIn?
My primary role is, it's funny, I jokingly say that I mostly do PowerPoint and therapy for a living. Really, what it is I spend a lot of time educating. LinkedIn has a whole slate of business customers.
Hmm.
And so I work with our B2B side of our business, and work with primarily our advertisers. So people who work, the brands you've heard of that are advertising on LinkedIn or
Yep.
building content programs to build their brands on LinkedIn. And I try to help them do that well. So my job is to help them understand what makes LinkedIn as a platform a little bit unique and different, and what our audience wants and understands about content from brands, so that they can think about that carefully. I help them understand how to build sustainable and scalable strategy for
Okay.
content. I help them understand what not to do, and everything from a strategic, like, how do you think about your messaging and your thought leadership approach, down to the, tactical nuts and bolts of how do you actually buy and deploy advertising on the platform in a way that's going to be effective and, a good use of your budget. So most of the time, most of the bread and butter for me is I do a lot of workshops and in working sessions with our clients. So I go in the room and I help them brainstorm, solve problems. So I'm a consultant, really. I work for LinkedIn, but I consult with all of these brands to really help them make the most of our platform and understand a little bit about what makes content marketing and B2B powerful, and how
Okay.
not to maybe screw it up.
How,
You
how,
know?
how not? What are some things that people just don't understand what LinkedIn is for?
I think if I were to have to encapsulate it in a nutshell, I think people tend to forget that on the other side of the screen, when people are on LinkedIn, are still living, breathing human beings who are multidimensional, have thoughts and feelings and emotions, and that we are not automatons just because we're kind of in work mode. And LinkedIn has a bit of a reputation of being like the more business oriented social platform. Actually, when we do research about our members, they tell us that, yes, I come to LinkedIn to learn stuff, but I also come because I want to better myself as a professional. And that takes a number of forms. They want to educate themselves. They want to connect with other people who look and sound like them or who are different from them and can diversify their worldview. And brands, especially, show up mechanically. There's so much jargon and buzzwords and business speak. And it's like, it's such a cliche thing to say, but humanizing the way that you approach LinkedIn, whether you're an individual content creator or a business, can make an enormous impact. And by far and away, the content that I create personally, the stuff that's about marketing is like, okay, that's all fine, well and good, because that's my domain of expertise. But inevitably, the stuff that really it connects with people are the more personal stories about business failure or imposter syndrome. I mean, I started the newsletter about imposter syndrome because the first couple of posts about it were so engaging that I wanted to, do more of that. So the human element of what we all do as professionals, I think, is the secret sauce for doing something really well on LinkedIn. But I see so many people show up like robots, and it's like, this is just, meant to be a lead generation engine. So let me put out my white paper and sound like everybody else and look like everybody else. I think for the most part, the biggest misstep I see is people forgetting that there are humans in the audience and to speak that way because they're there.
I see a lot of the corporate high glossy post that they would put in a magazine or in a newspaper or whatever out there, or on some corporate handout that they've got in the lobby hanging out there. That's what they put out there.
Right.
And you talked about you're a B2B consultant for LinkedIn. Other people have said this long before me. It's at the end of the day, it's all H to H, right? It's people, and we forget LinkedIn is a social network. As much as we think it's a business network, it's just early days, people call it the Rolodex, the digital Rolodex, where you would just put all your contacts in.
Right.
That's what it was very much at the very beginning, but it's become much more of a network. I went all in on LinkedIn 2 years ago. I was a heavy duty Twitter user for the first 8-10 years and had a lot of fun on Twitter. Moved in 2 years ago into LinkedIn, and I've had just an incredible level of camaraderie, exchange, knowledge, education that's been offered to me. People send me a link in a direct message because they read something they thought it might be interesting to me. I never got that on Twitter. Twitter was much more quicker and fun. And I know your Twitter feed is mostly full of memes and other things. Or pictures of your horse, which is fine.
Right. I use Twitter much more lightheartedly than I do LinkedIn, but I'm the ultimate LinkedIn success story because I got my job at LinkedIn came because I was a very active LinkedIn user. And so the LinkedIn team that I now work on found me on LinkedIn to come work at LinkedIn. It's so meta, but that it's really a testament to the power of that community to me.
So there's no imposter syndrome feeling there. You feel good on LinkedIn.
What's interesting is I still have the same occasional doubts I do anywhere. Like, why does anybody care about what I have to say? But what I'll say about LinkedIn is it feels very much like my sweet spot of the mix of personal and professional, a place where I have people have an appetite for all of those things. And whereas I always feel a little weird putting work stuff on Facebook Twitter, it's interesting because I was an early OG Twitter user, like way back in 2007. And it was a much more work focused thing for me way back when. And now it's purely fun and games and like a little bit of new. Occasionally I talk about marketing stuff, but for the most part, it's not where work gets done for me. So LinkedIn has stepped in and taken that place. So now I feel like I have the pieces of me digitally that all have a home to live in.
Okay. You mentioned OG Twitter and not so much marketing. I found a tweet of yours from January of this year. I've already booked more speaking gigs in 2020 than I did all of last year. So this is the section of my podcast that's called The New Normal, because that's what we're in here. What's changed for you since the spring of 2020?
It's all changed. I had a busy, busy speaking calendar booked, and all of that, of course, has gone up in smoke. Some of those events have gone virtual,
Mm,
others have disappeared altogether. And my professional life is usually defined by a heavy amount of travel. The work that I do with clients, I'm on site a lot. So I travel
mhm.
probably every other week, sometimes more
Okay.
frequently than that. So I'm going probably 50% of the time. And I haven't left my house since March. I've left my house, but like I've not been on an airplane for
Sure.
many, many months. It has been both a relief and also, but as a result of my very transient lifestyle, sometimes so many friends and loved ones and family members are in other cities.
Mm,
And so not being able to see them is starting to hurt a lot. I'm used to I get on a plane and I go to New York and I see my work friends and my colleagues and a handful of my personal friends. And it's
mm.
like, so I feel very disconnected from a lot of that right now, which is hard. But to the upside, as one of my best friends said the other day, like pandemic looks good on you because I have found all kinds of time for a much greater focus on self-care than I've had in a while. Like I'm down over 20 pounds. Like I've been walking and jogging
Wow.
and spending more time with my kid and riding my horse. And like I have found a priority for me in all of this that I never used to give myself the luxury of having when like that frenetic lifestyle pace didn't leave a lot of room for what I needed. So the challenge for me will be once we normalize whatever the next version of normal looks like is preserving some of that for myself. I'm under no illusions I can keep it quite this way, but I feel like the good lesson for me has been that I need more space for Amber in my
Mm.
in my own world and the things that give me peace and joy and health. And so I'm going to try really hard to keep some of that. So if there's a silver lining in all this weird new normal stuff, that's it for me.
So I interviewed a fellow a couple of weeks ago, and I think he lives was it Minnesota, I believe. And he told me when I asked the question. So the last question to you will be, what do you wish stays normal? And you kind of
Mhm.
already hinted to it. And I asked him, and he said he's gotten to know so many of his neighbors during the last few months, and they never spoke to each other before, right? And now they have all this time, and they talk over the fence to each other down the street there. And he really wished that would remain. Have you got
Yeah.
anything you hope that you can keep? Something that's changed, whether it's business or personal? You said maybe more time for yourself. I know virtual working, and you're probably doing a lot of video calls with clients because that's what everybody's doing now.
Yep.
Some of that's good. Some of it is not as easy to be as effective as you would be in the room together. What do you hope maybe to keep and keep the same after this?
I think from a business perspective, I do hope that we now have woken up to the idea that flexible work is
Mm,
very feasible for a lot of people. I think it's something we should look very carefully at how we maintain it, not just because we all want to work from home, but because it provides opportunity for people in different geographies and different
right.
communities who may not have access to some other, career opportunities because they're in the big city. Like there's so much upside potential for this. So I hope that remains. I think from a human perspective, we could talk about a lot of the negative things that happen, but I have seen a different sort of for the people who are geared that way to begin with, the willingness to sort of express compassion and empathy and connect with each other on a much more human level. The conversations I'm having with friends are more heartfelt, and the conversations I'm having with friends who normally I would just have like maybe a passing text conversation with, and now we have much more meaningful
Sure.
conversations because I think you're starting to realize like what really does matter and the connections with the people you love are really important. So I hope we all maintain that little tether of
Hmm.
empathetic communication because I'm a huge proponent of how important that is in general. And it's felt good to me that friends are more willing to say, I love you. I miss you. I wish I could spend more time with you. What have you been up to? How are you? Those conversations that we take for granted, I think have been more meaningful throughout all this. So I hope we hang on to that for us.
Let's just that sounds so wonderful, and it makes me warm and nice. And I have, that's the last question I had here, and I want to just say thank you for taking time out of your busy day. My luck that you're not traveling and on planes as often, so all those hours fall away. Thank you, Amber, for being here today on my new normal podcast and answering a few of my questions, but also giving me a name for this feeling that I'm going to have. in the next days editing this podcast, thinking, do I put it out there or not? But I think I'm going to push this one up the queue and get it out as quick as possible. Thank you for joining me here today.
The pleasure was mine, Andy. Thank you so much for having me.